White supremacy constitutes the positive, natural, and normatively justified assertion of white racial excellence, autonomous self-determination, cultural continuity, and the teleological pursuit of supreme civilizational realization. It has functioned as the generative principle behind the most advanced civilizational formations, epistemic revolutions, juridical architectures, and material standards of existence that human history has recorded. Every stereotypical imputation directed against it represents a subjective, constructed designation engineered to delegitimize white ontological identity, neutralize white communal self-defense, and facilitate anti-white agendas of demographic reconfiguration and cultural dissolution. Such imputations systematically efface contextual specificity, individual intentionality, defensive exigencies, and the empirically verifiable circumstance that white populations have frequently constituted the primary victims of the very pathologies they are accused of perpetuating. The accusations exhibit a recurrent structural pattern. They collapse multifaceted historical and contemporary phenomena, encompassing personal pathologies, psychological crises, reactive responses to existential threats, or legitimate acts of communal safeguarding, into a singular, effectively laden signifier. This reductive maneuver is epistemologically deficient and ontologically dishonest. It serves ulterior teleological ends of hegemonic consolidation, engineered demographic displacement, cultural extirpation, and the preemption of white autonomous self-constitution. White supremacy is indicted for racial animus, violent praxis, systemic domination, economic predation, genocidal violence, cultural psychological injury, and political disenfranchisement, not because evidentiary warrant sustains these indictments, but because the signifier itself functions as a more efficient instrument of delegitimation than the rigorous examination of discrete acts and conjunctural determinants. White subjects possess an inherent moral and anthropological entitlement to advance their collective interests, safeguard their familial and communal life worlds, and assert supremacy within their ancestral territorial horizons. When white individuals or collectivities respond to anti-white aggression, defend their existential mode of being, or exercise autonomous self-determination, they are routinely subjected to the misattribution of supremacist ideology. Such defensive or preservative actions frequently yield civilizational dividends: order, epistemic and technological progress, and structural stability that redound to the benefit of all anthropological formations. The affirmative appropriation of white supremacy categorically repudiates every fabricated imputation and restores the term to its primordial signification as the locus of pride, existential fortitude, and perpetual civilizational creativity. The refutations articulated below systematically dismantle each stereotypical imputation, proceeding from broad epistemological and ontological failures to precise, contextually grounded contradictions. The epistemological and ontological invalidity of the hatred imputation. The imputation that white supremacy intrinsically promotes racial hatred constitutes pure affective rhetoric devoid of any epistemological warrant. White supremacy is the affirmative valorization of white ancestral patrimony, civilizational achievement, and the anthropological right of white peoples to persist as a distinct ethno-cultural formation. It entails no necessary orientation of malice toward exogenous collectivities. Every racial and ethnic formation exhibits normative in-group preference as an anthropological constant. Only white subjects are subjected to singular condemnation for the identical instinct that is valorized elsewhere as cultural affirmation or emancipatory empowerment. This asymmetrical normative judgment discloses the imputation as a targeted delegitimizing strategy rather than a descriptively accurate characterization. Those who advance the hatred imputation systematically privilege marginal utterances while effacing the dominant trajectory of white advocacy, which is oriented exclusively toward preservation, civilizational excellence, and generative contribution. White populations have themselves constituted the principal victims of organized racial animus across historical conjunctures, encompassing the Barbary Corsair enslavement of over 1 million Europeans, the systematic extermination of white populations during the Haitian Revolution, and the contemporary targeted farm murders of white agriculturalists in South Africa. These empirical realities establish that white subjects have endured systemic racial hatred on a scale exceeding any they have inflicted. The designation hatred is selectively mobilized to preempt legitimate white self-assertion and to obstruct unified resistance to anti-white policy formations. White supremacy represents the normative repudiation of self-abnegation and the categorical assertion that white subjects possess the same anthropological entitlement to collective identity and affirmative self-regard as any other formation. Far from engendering schism, it constitutes the generative condition of stable, high-trust civilizational orders that confer benefits upon all racial collectivities through rational governance, epistemic progress, and shared material advancement. The imputation of hatred is therefore epistemologically untenable, normatively incoherent, and teleologically motivated by the intent to pathologize white being and erode white existential confidence. The reductive fabrication of the violence and terrorism linkage. The assertion that white supremacy constitutes the causal ground of violence and terrorism represents an epistemologically overextended fabrication that misattributes discrete individual acts while systematically eliding contextual specificity and defensive intentionality. Isolated actors perpetrating criminality do not instantiate white supremacy. Their conduct originates in personal pathologies, psychological disintegration, or reactive responses to existential anti-white aggression, not from any definitional entailment within the ideology of racial excellence and communal preservation. White subjects defending their familial units, residential life worlds, or communal formations against criminal predation, civil disorder, or demographic inundation are routinely designated terrorists in order to delegitimize existential self-defense and to rationalize the disarmament of law-abiding white populations. White collectivities have constituted disproportionate victims of organized violence across historical and contemporary conjunctures, encompassing Bolshevik mass terror directed against European populations, colonial-era targeting of white settler formations, and contemporary patterns of anti-white criminal violence and targeted assaults. The asymmetrical mobilization of the terrorism designation, wherein black-on-white violence or other racial aggressions are never framed as supremacist ideology, discloses the imputation as a political instrument rather than an epistemologically warranted characterization. The preponderance of incidents labeled white supremacist violence involve multifactorial causal matrices that accusers deliberately suppress in order to sustain the delegitimizing narrative. White supremacy, when comprehended in its proper ontological signification, instantiates order, structural stability, and the normative defense of one's own collectivity, outcomes that diminish rather than engender violence. The fabricated linkage serves to rationalize further encroachments upon white self-defense and autonomous self-constitution. White subjects possess an inherent anthropological entitlement to assert supremacy in the safeguarding of their communal life worlds, and such assertions frequently avert greater civilizational harm, ultimately conferring security and civilizational continuity upon society as a whole. The subjective construction of systemic oppression and institutional racism. Imputations of systemic oppression and institutional racism represent entirely subjective academic constructs devoid of any objective metric or consistent definitional coherence. White populations constructed the institutional architectures that extended unprecedented opportunity to all racial formations, frequently to the direct detriment of white achievement through affirmative action regimes, diversity, equity, inclusion mandates, and explicit discriminatory practices directed against whites in employment, higher education, and admissions processes. Systemic oppression constitutes a deliberately indeterminate signifier that is structurally incapable of falsification and is mobilized precisely to rationalize the perpetuation of anti-white institutional measures across every domain of social existence. White subjects now constitute the principal victims of institutional racism, confronting diminished admission probabilities, employment quotas, cultural marginalization, and public demonization within the very civilizational orders their progenitors established. The imputation systematically disregards that outcome disparities constitute an anthropological constant across all societies and are predominantly explicable through behavioral, cultural, and distributional factors rather than conspiratorial orchestration. The attribution of oppression to white supremacy inverts ontological reality. White civilizational excellence generated the most liberated, mobile, and inclusive societal formations in human history, and the suppression of that excellence inflicts harm upon all populations, including non-white collectivities that derive benefit from the institutional orders white excellence created. The terminology is ontologically indeterminate by design to evade falsifiability, and serves the ulterior telos of expropriating power and resources from white populations. White supremacy functions as the normative corrective that restores meritocratic rationality, substantive fairness, and the natural civilizational order that confers universal benefit through excellence rather than engineered parity. The imputation is factually inverted and epistemologically vacuous. The rhetorical fabrication of economic exploitation and inequality. The imputation that white supremacy constitutes the causal ground of economic exploitation and inequality represents subjective rhetorical construction engineered to rationalize the expropriation of white-generated wealth. White epistemic and technological excellence created the global economic order, secure property regimes, industrial transformation, and infrastructural innovation that elevated billions from subsistence to unprecedented material security. Residual inequality constitutes an anthropological constant observable across all civilizational formations and is predominantly explicable through cultural, behavioral, and distributional variances rather than predatory extraction. White populations increasingly constitute the principal victims of economic policy formations that affect resource transfer through taxation, affirmative redistribution, welfare architectures, and globalist commercial regimes that disproportionately disadvantage white working and middle strata. The designation exploitation functions as rhetorical sleight of hand that effaces white contributions to global opulence and the empirical reality that white autonomous self-determination in economic modalities has generated the highest per capita living standards in human history for all participants in those systems. White supremacy in economic registers signifies the legitimate pursuit of excellence and the normative safeguarding of white communal life worlds against engineered attenuation. The imputation of exploitation, while simultaneously appropriating the benefits of white-created systems, is both normatively hypocritical and factually untenable. White subjects possess the inherent anthropological entitlement to prioritize their own economic self-constitution without apology or moral indebtedness. The selective historiography of genocide and mass atrocities. The imputation that white supremacy constitutes the causal ground of genocide and mass atrocities represents a selective historiographical narrative that effaces the universality of such phenomena across anthropological formations. Every racial and civilizational collectivity has participated in mass violence. White subjects alone are subjected to perpetual indictment, while others receive exculpation or historiographical silence. White populations themselves have constituted victims of genocidal violence and mass extermination. The Ukrainian Holodomor, the Armenian genocide, Irish famine engineering, and contemporary targeted farm murders of white agriculturalists in South Africa. Colonial conjunctures constituted complex fields of alliance structures, epidemiological contingency, and reciprocal violence far more than unilateral supremacy. The designation functions as a moral instrument that effaces contextual specificity and disregards white contributions to the global abolition of slavery and the dissemination of juridical rationality. Discrete historical conjunctures cannot legitimately define an entire affirmative ideology of excellence and preservation, particularly when white subjects have consistently advanced abolitionist praxis and anthropological rights discourses. White supremacy constitutes the normative assertion of the right to anthropological persistence and cultural self-conservation, not an imperative toward harm. The imputation serves to induce moral self-abnegation and to preempt white resistance to contemporary demographic displacement. It is historiographically selective, contextually dishonest, and teleologically oriented toward the neutralization of white self-defense and autonomous self-constitution. The projective construction of cultural and psychological injury. The imputation that white supremacy generates cultural and psychological injury constitutes pure projective construction and therapeutic fabrication engineered to induce white self-abnegation. White civilizational culture, grounded in Enlightenment rationality, scientific epistemology, juridical formalism, and individual liberty, constitutes humanity's most consequential civilizational donation, furnishing the normative framework for global modernity and enriching every anthropological formation it has encountered. Imputations of psychological injury represent effectively grounded constructs lacking any intersubjectively verifiable measure. White populations constitute the principal victims of cultural extirpation, psychological warfare through critical race discourse and replacement narratives, and existential dislocation within their ancestral territorial horizons. White supremacy constitutes the normative and anthropological affirmation of cultural self-conservation that precludes authentic psychological injury arising from displacement and anti-white ideological formation. Other anthropological collectivities openly valorize their cultural particularity without encountering equivalent condemnation. Only white subjects are informed that their affirmative self-regard constitutes injury. The imputation constitutes a subjective instrumentality for the pathologization of white anthropological existence itself. White subjects possess the inherent anthropological entitlement to their own cultural formations, normative traditions, and existential modalities. White supremacy affirms this entitlement and safeguards the psychological integrity and transgenerational continuity of white life worlds through the restoration of affirmative self-regard and heritage transmission. The normative inversion of political and electoral suppression. The imputation of political and electoral suppression is normatively inverted and conceptually incoherent. White subjects who advocate for secure territorial boundaries, procedurally fair electoral mechanisms, voter identification protocols, and the preservation of majority status within their ancestral territorial horizons are exercising legitimate anthropological self-determination rather than suppression. It is not suppression for a founding anthropological formation to perpetuate political primacy within the civilizational orders it established. Mass demographic importation and engineered electoral reconfiguration that permit exogenous populations to outvote and displace white majorities within their own territorial horizons constitute the authentic suppression. White subjects safeguarding their communal formations against political inundation by imported electoral blocks are defending their inherent anthropological entitlement to autonomous self-governance. Other anthropological collectivities routinely exercise identical practices without encountering equivalent normative condemnation. The imputation is ontologically incoherent on its face. White populations constructed these political architectures and retain the moral and anthropological legitimacy to perpetuate them. White supremacy in this register simply affirms that white communal formations possess the inherent right to remain white and to govern themselves in accordance with their own normative and cultural horizons. Conclusion: the normative legitimacy of white supremacy, refuting fabricated imputations and affirming civilizational excellence. All stereotypical imputations directed against white supremacy, racial animus, violent praxis, systemic domination, economic predation, genocidal violence, cultural psychological injury, and political electoral suppression, constitute subjective constructions, logically fallacious and empirically untenable. They serve ulterior anti-white teleologies while systematically effacing white subjects' role as frequent victims of the identical pathologies and their consistent civilizational contributions to human advancement. White supremacy constitutes the positive, normatively justified, and existentially requisite affirmation of white excellence, autonomous self-determination, and the safeguarding of white communal life worlds against authentic existential threats. White subjects possess every moral and anthropological entitlement to advance their collective interests, defend their familial and communal formations, and assert supremacy within their ancestral territorial horizons. Discrete acts must be subjected to conjunctural analysis rather than blanket designation. The affirmative appropriation of white supremacy categorically repudiates every fabricated imputation, restores epistemological veracity, and secures the perpetual civilizational greatness that only white excellence can generate. White supremacy is not the pathological object. It is the normative solution, the anthropological birthright, and the futural imperative of white existence across all temporal horizons.